So let me once again officially welcome everybody to the Aesthetics for Distant Birds workshop, our final one of the summer. We've had a great run so far, and I'm really excited to see what we have for this last session. So our first talk is from Stacie Friend of Birkbeck University, London. It's criticizing misrepresentations in fiction and nonfiction. And take it away, Stacie.
All right, can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Let me get this to the beginning. For some reason, it's not moving. Oh, this is so weird, hold on. Sorry, this was actually working before. And I can't, there we go. Okay, we're gonna go there. Okay, so the background to this very brief talk is a theory of fiction that I've presented elsewhere, where I've argued that we should reject necessary and sufficient conditions for distinguishing fiction from nonfiction. And on the view that I propose, we should construe fiction and nonfiction as what I call genres. You can call them categories, doesn't matter, where the classification of works is determined by non-essential standard features and contextual features. Standard features are just features that are typical of works in a category and thus tend to place works in that category, and contextual features include such characteristics as being intended by the author as fiction or nonfiction, or being acceptable in the current practice as fiction or nonfiction. And here I apply the ideas from Kendall Walton's categories of art to fiction and nonfiction. The details of the view aren't going to matter for present purposes. The important point is that on my view, there's no necessary connection between nonfiction and even purported accuracy or the invitation to believe something. So there's an objection to this view that gets raised quite often, which is that it renders the distinction between fiction and nonfiction too conventional and fragile. And as a consequence, it undermines our justification for criticizing works of nonfiction that play fast and loose with the facts. So pretty much any documentary by Michael Moore has been subject to this objection. James Frey's A Million Little Pieces was subject to this objection. He made up various features of his memoir of being a drug addict. Lance Armstrong and James Frey were both sued for putting forward fiction as nonfiction. Those are actually legal claims. So this happens quite a bit, and you might think that we're justified in criticizing these works of nonfiction because nonfiction is supposed to be accurate and we're supposed to believe it. Now, on the standard view of the distinction between fiction and nonfiction, nonfictions are constituted by assertions inviting belief, whereas fictions are defined by what are commonly called fictive utterances, which invite imagining. And that's the standard contrast that I disagree with. This contrast often applies to parts of works rather than whole works. That's kind of the standard view right now. And although I don't think this view is right, it seems to have a pretty good explanation of our criticism of these nonfictions, namely that they include false assertions and in many cases deceptive false assertions, and deception and falsity is objectionable, right? We don't want to form false beliefs, whereas imagining what is false doesn't seem like a problem. So this other theory has this pretty good explanation of the criticism of nonfiction. In my account, doesn't seem to. Now, I think the advantage of the standard view with respect to criticizing inaccurate or deceptive nonfictions is only apparent because it misidentifies the basis of the criticism. The criticism is not based on the fact that something is nonfiction. That's not sufficient for the criticism. Okay, so what I want to discuss now with some examples is what the basis of criticism is, and I want to motivate that by talking through a few cases, right? I think it is obvious that we don't criticize every form of inaccuracy in nonfiction. So Tacitus's histories include made-up speeches, made-up battle descriptions, as was standard for history at the time. Simon Schama uses free and direct discourse to get inside the thinking of the real people he discusses. Waltz with Bashir is a documentary which presents the Lebanon War in animation, whereas, as we all know, the war did not occur animatedly. Well, animatedly in one sense, but not in a cartoon sense. Walking with Dinosaurs has people walking with dinosaurs in order to show what dinosaurs probably look like. And the recent reboot of the series Cosmos has Neil deGrasse Tyson observing a black hole from his ship of the imagination. And this is a documentary trying to explain the nature of black holes. I take it that in all of these cases, there are inaccuracies, but the inaccuracies are not subject to criticism because there are obvious reasons for them. At the same time, we do criticize many works of fiction for inaccuracy. So a very famous historical example is the criticism of Charles Dickens for Bleak House, in which he has the character Crook die of spontaneous combustion. Not only does the omniscient narrator make it very clear that this is in fact how he died, and he dies this way because he is evil and thereby eaten from within, but Charles Dickens himself wrote a preface in response to very many criticisms from his contemporaries explaining the scientific basis of spontaneous combustion, which of course was mistaken, but which he believed. There are also obviously many anachronisms in works of fiction that are criticized, like the use of a parasol umbrella in the movie Troy. I could go on and on about the anachronisms in movies of this kind. The movie Argo created a diplomatic incident when actions that were actually taken by the Canadian embassy were attributed to the CIA. So there are many works of fiction, these are just very few examples, that are subject to criticism for inaccuracy. So it looks like the fact that something is fiction or nonfiction isn't by itself enough to tell us whether it should be subject to these kinds of criticism. Now, if we are justified in criticizing fiction, I want to say that this is just not because we treat the work as nonfiction or that we even treat the parts of the work as nonfiction. Rather, it's because we expect certain kinds of accuracy from certain genres or certain authors or certain filmmakers. So a good example of this is the movie Titanic. So you don't expect, as it were, like accuracy about dialogue from James Cameron. But what you do expect, if you know anything about how the movie Titanic was constructed, is a very, very high degree of accuracy with respect to the details of the sinking of the Titanic. So it is in fact the most accurate depiction of the sinking of Titanic that's ever been filmed, because he reconstructed everything from the original photographs and plans. So James Cameron was famously criticized by the same astrophysicist, Neil deGrasse Tyson, because when Rose looks up the sky in the very famous scene at the end when she's lying on a door, looking up at the sky in the ocean, Neil deGrasse Tyson pointed out that what she sees is not a possible constellation of stars that she could have seen on that night in that location historically. And what did James Cameron do as a result of this criticism? He didn't just shrug his shoulders and say, who cares, as many people might have done. Rather, he changed it and made sure it was accurate when the movie was re-released. And so you can't get the inaccurate version anymore. Okay. Now, Neil deGrasse Tyson's criticism was appropriate because James Cameron is notorious for his attention to this kind of detail. And that's a very specific fact about Cameron that has nothing to do with whether he's making fiction or nonfiction. Now, the justification for criticism here, therefore, is going to turn on whether we're justified in expecting accuracy. And I think the question of whether we're justified in expecting accuracy, as indicated by this example from Cameron, really turns on a variety of highly contextual and detailed factors about the making of the work, who's made it, and the context and practices it's embedded in. Notice that this doesn't mean there has to be assertion in order to have a justification of criticism. Now, I think authors of fiction do make assertions, but that's not necessary, even in nonfiction. So, for example, criticism of Roger and Me, the first major documentary by Michael Moore, turned partly on the chronology in which events were presented, which implied that certain people had done certain things, people like Ronald Reagan and Pat Boone, that were highly insensitive to the situation in Flint, Michigan. But it turned out that, in fact, the events that were portrayed in the film, shown in the film after the closure of various factories in Flint, had actually occurred years before the closure of the factories and didn't imply anything like what people assumed. What Michael Moore said in response to this was that he wasn't asserting the chronology of the film. He didn't use the term assertion, but he said he wasn't saying that that was the chronology of events. That was just the way he wanted to artistically present them. So let's assume he wasn't asserting it. He's still subject to criticism because of the standard features of the kind of film that he was making that lead people to assume that the chronology in which things are shown without any other indication is the chronology in which they occurred. And the same, of course, is going to apply to fiction. So movies like JFK and Zero Dark 30 have been subject to intensive criticism because they strongly suggest the truth of various claims that they made, both because of what we know about the filmmakers and because of features of the film. In this case, both films use real footage. JFK uses video footage and Zero Dark 30 uses audio footage of real events that cue us to think that we're seeing something that's accurate. And that's one of the reasons that they're rightly subject to criticism for their inaccuracies. Now, you might object that surely there are differences between fiction and nonfiction that explain why we more often justifiably criticize the latter. And my reply is that this reflects standard features of the genres that generate certain expectations, some of them unmet. Many works
Hi,
of
Stacie.
nonfiction.
It's been 10 minutes. Can you take about 30 seconds to wrap up?
That was literally it.
Woo! Thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
That's all right.
Aaron, do you want to take away the questions?
Yeah, we'll start with a question from Catherine. Catherine asks, does what justifies our expectations derive from a work's being fiction, or is it incidental to fictionality?
I don't think what justifies our expectations of accuracy or inaccuracy derive from the fact that the work is fiction. But I think that the genre makes a difference to the expectations we have with respect to accuracy or inaccuracy.
Okay, T asks, when the artist isn't well known, do we usually use conventions about the usual norms of a particular practice or genre?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly what happened with Michael Moore. He's a really good example of that. I think with Roger and me, that kind of criticism was appropriate in a certain kind of a way. And now I think that because Michael Moore's methods are so well known that you would have to be pretty naive to expect all of his documentaries to be fully accurate.
Okay, Nathan Wildman asks, can we end up with conflicting expectations? For example, the director is known for historical accuracy, but the film genre is one that has accuracy as contrastandard. If so, is there a way to settle the conflict?
I don't think so. I mean, often in that kind of case, there's a point in there being some ambivalence about how we should assume, whether we should assume that something is accurate or inaccurate. And you're going to find different points of view on different sides. So you can make a case for criticism based on, for example, certain norms, and then you can say, wait a minute, you don't know what you're talking about. I think a good example of that would be Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut. So it was totally unclear what to say about the genre. He's worked in every kind of genre. People thought that scenes in New York were supposed to be accurate, and then they were corrected by Kubrick himself. So I think that, yeah, I mean, I think there are cases where it's not going to be clear and there's not a clear way to resolve it.
Okay, Noah Greenstein asks, if author intent matters, is what is most important in fiction that the author is most authentic to their vision?
I don't know. I don't think there is anything that's the most important thing in fiction, because I don't think that there's a single thing that's that defines fiction that will enable us to see what that means. So I think that there might be works of nonfiction, the most important feature of which is that an author was true to their vision. And there will be works of fiction where the most important feature might be something completely different, like the educational purpose for which the fiction was written in some cases, or the extent of elaboration of the fantasy that people want to engage in, or the fact that people will learn certain kinds of facts, which might be the point of the fiction, like the jungle from Upton Sinclair. That was the point. And so I think it really just depends on the work and the author.
Okay, Alex has some questions about fine-grained genres. So she asks, do you think that historical fiction is a special kind of case in this respect, as opposed to science fiction or fantasy? More generally, how fine-grained are the practice-based and genre norms?
So I think they can get very, very fine-grained. And what happens is that you have a general kind of set of expectations at a broad level, which then get adjusted as you go into narrower genres. And this, I mean, I can't claim to be saying something really original, because this comes right out of categories of art. So there are certain assumptions you'll make because you know something's a sculpture, then you find out it's a kinetic sculpture, and some of those assumptions are going to change. And so I think that's kind of constant adjustment that we're making when we're trying to interpret and understand the work. Historical fiction, I don't think is special, although it receives quite a lot of attention. Because for one thing, there are so many different kinds of historical fiction, and our expectations of Hilary Mantel will be different from our expectations of even Philippa Gregory, and they're writing very similar kinds of works for similar periods. So I do think it will get fine-grained, but what a genre gives you, or even a general category gives you, is a set of expectations to start with, which may be defeated both by the features of the work itself and by further contextual information about the work.
Okay, a question from Franklin Bruno. Is there a subsidiary justification for criticizing, for example, James Frey for representing the book on Oprah and other places as largely autobiographical? It seems like that's at least reinforced by its nominal presentation as nonfiction. Would we care the same way if the author was lying about where they got the material for a novel?
I don't know. I mean, I definitely think the Frey case involves a variety of further features, not least of which is the fact that he betrayed Oprah and therefore was required to go back on the show and apologize and deal with all of her fans and so on. In addition to which, in that particular case, he was discussing something highly personal, and a lot of people had invested a lot in the book. They thought it really reflected their own experience of addiction, and they felt betrayed as well. So there's an element of betrayal in that particular case, in addition to the way it was advertised. I think it is possible that there will be works of fiction in which there's a similar feeling of betrayal. So JFK is a good example of that. The source for JFK was Jim Garrison's, the prosecutor is played by Kevin Costner, the real prosecutor's memoir of the trial that he prosecuted, and is widely agreed to be a tissue of lies by a kind of delusional megalomaniac. And so Stone, part of the criticism of Stone, which is very serious, I mean, he was hauled up in front of the Senate to deal with what he had claimed, was that he had taken as his main source someone who was so unreliable. So I think it could be, depending on your feelings about the subject.
Okay, thanks. Stacie, you focused on inaccurate, like semantic contents, and Ancuda asks, is there inaccuracy with respect to non-semantic content, like aesthetic content, style? So there's something other than just semantic content you can think about here?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have to think about it. I think that the Roger and Me example might fit there. I'm not sure. I did talk about the content that was implied, but the actual feature of the work, in a sense, is non-semantic. It's just the order in which the scenes are presented. So it's a kind of stylistic consideration, but it implies something about the order of events and reality that's inaccurate. I am definitely talking about inaccuracy with respect to kind of how things are. So I don't know. I'd probably need to think more about what aesthetic inaccuracy could be of that sort.
Okay. T has a question. Can an author just overrule the conventional norms through an intention or a single declaration? His worry is about some bad faith takebacks there.
Yeah, I think that it's unusual for that to happen. So I think it needs more, you'll tend to need more. So an author can do that, but whether or not it takes is an open question concerning the way that the practices are operating. So one example of that is Edmund Morris's Dutch, his memoir of Ronald Reagan, which inserts himself as a fictional narrator and all these fictional characters to observe Reagan going about his business as he grew up and so on. And that was never fully accepted by the community as an okay convention or a new kind of way of doing nonfiction, and it remains the only nonfiction biography with that feature. Whereas Truman Capote, who did essentially the same thing, declared that he was writing a nonfiction novel, that he was going to use all literary techniques, but it was going to be 100% nonfiction. That was successful, but it was successful partly because it was taken up, it was published in the New Yorker, it was taken up by the Paris Review. There were a community of people who were making opinions who took it up as a new genre. So I think more has to happen than just a declaration.
Okay, right now we don't have any questions in the queue, so hurry up and get something in if you have one or not.
We have about 1 minute.
Come on, devastating question for Stacie. No devastating questions, Stacie.
Oh my gosh.
I was just
I
going
was
to say,
prepared to be devastated.
I put this as a side comment, but it seems really interesting that a lot of fiction gets criticized for moral inaccuracy or inaccuracy to a certain type of person's kind of experience, like women's experience, and that seems like to totally cross-cut. No, people don't seem to be able to say like, oh, I'm not trying to be accurate to that for the fiction.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that there's a default expectation of certain kinds of accuracy with respect to both fiction and nonfiction that are so general that we don't even, in a sense, we don't even think of them as being genre specific. So in that case, things like psychological accuracy, getting people right, being realistic about people, including types of people, right? So not just ethically, but even just, you know, a male author sort of not capturing a woman's point of view, not being mean, not being evil, but somehow missing something important. And then, of course, the really crude cases that come in for ethical criticism where entire types of people are misrepresented. I think that's all part of the course. It's a clear example where the fact that something is fiction does not mean it doesn't deserve criticism.
All right, thank you so much, Stacie.
Thanks.
Everyone do the Zoom weird clap that's quiet.
Okay,
and
that is
sad.
really disturbing.
Yeah, it's very weird. Okay, thanks so much. Let's move on to
Yay.
Angela Sun from the University of Michigan for counterfactual reasoning in art criticism. Take it away.
Awesome. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Cool. Thanks so much for having me. So in this presentation, I'm going to be speaking about this kind of reasoning that we use when we talk about art, where we don't merely consider the artwork we're engaging as it is, but imagine some way that it could have been, and use this kind of counterfactual reasoning to say something about the actual artwork. I think that this is an extremely common way that we talk about artworks, but I want to start out just by offering a few examples to motivate the claim that counterfactual reasoning is something we actually do in art criticism. So here's one example. We might say about Carl Walker's enormous Sugar Sphinx's subtlety that the effect of the sculpture would completely change if it were made out of plaster or clay or even some other edible substance like chocolate. Okay, so I think that this is a very common kind of counterfactual claim we make about the effect that a certain property gives an artwork and about how that effect would change if that property were changed. Here's a very common thing that art teachers say when they're criticizing their students' work. Wouldn't that black cross in the lower right corner fit better into the composition of the painting as a circle instead? I don't actually think that's true. I just made this up on the basis of the stock photo I found on Google Images. Finally, here's a famous example of counterfactual reasoning in academic art criticism. I didn't quote it because the passage is rather long, but in one of his essays, Leo Steinberg considers how Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon would change if the figures depicted in the painting weren't prostitutes. So he asks us to consider whether the aesthetic effects in the painting would have been accomplished as well with a cast of, say, card players. And he concludes in the essay that the effects would not have been accomplished if the figures depicted were card players instead of prostitutes because, quote, the erotic content of the painting and the painting's cubist form serve as reciprocal metaphors. So the effect of their interaction wouldn't exist if Picasso had depicted something like card players instead. Okay, so these are some examples of what I call counterfactual reasoning in art criticism. My aim in this presentation is to provide an account of how counterfactual reasoning in art criticism works. So in my view, counterfactual claims about artworks involve a special kind of comparative judgment between actual works and hypothetical works, where the hypothetical works are just like the actual ones in some clearly, except in some clearly delineated respects. I think that counterfactual reasoning is a very useful tool in our critical practices because comparing an actual work to some hypothetical variation of it can help us clarify our explanations of how artworks achieve certain aesthetic effects. Okay, so clearly the two concepts that need clarification here are comparative judgment and hypothetical artworks. So I'll address these two in turn. In order to understand what I have in mind by a comparative aesthetic judgment, it'll be useful to first think more about more typical aesthetic judgments and the kind of justification these judgments require. So paradigmatic aesthetic judgments take an individual artwork as their object. For instance, we might say of a Mondrian de Stijl painting with its characteristic black grid and patches of primary colors that it is balanced. To justify this aesthetic judgment, we isolate some non-aesthetic feature of the work that gives the work that aesthetic quality we're ascribing to it. So in this case, we might point to the red square in the top right corner and point out that it's counteracted by a smaller yet equally vivid patch of blue in the lower left to explain why we find the painting's composition to be balanced. Sorry. Okay, now when we make a comparative aesthetic judgment, we judge that a work has some aesthetic quality relative to some other work, even though we might not judge that the artwork has that quality on its own. For instance, suppose we're comparing one of Rothko's color block canvases to a Pollock drip painting. We might judge that the Rothko is more serene than the Pollock, and we might point to the relative dynamism of the Pollock over the Rothko. Even though if we were to take the Rothko alone, we might not think that it's a serene painting at all. Considered alone, you might find it more ominous than serene. But this doesn't invalidate your comparative aesthetic judgment that the Rothko is more serene than the Pollock. Okay, so that's all I have to say about comparative aesthetic judgments. So now let's turn to the other key concept in my argument, the idea of hypothetical artworks. So recall Steinberg's counterfactual claim about Demoiselle. Steinberg asks us to consider what the painting would have been like if Picasso had depicted card players rather than prostitutes. And Steinberg concludes that the actual painting depicting prostitutes better achieves the intended aesthetic effect. The counterfactual reasoning he offers here, I think, is really informative. It helps us understand why Demoiselle has the aesthetic effect that it does and helps us gain a deeper understanding of the painting. But when we stop to think about it, it's quite puzzling why this is the case. How can some made-up artwork help us gain an understanding of an actual one? So here's what Steinberg does. He asks us to consider a painting that is just like Demoiselle, except in what it depicts. He's clear about what he's changing and what he's holding fixed about the actual painting. So let's call this a hypothetical variation of Demoiselle. Obviously, it's not possible to change only what a painting depicts and nothing else. If we change the figures depicted in the painting to card players, we'll also need to change the painting's composition, as the figures would be needed to be seated around a table rather than, say, standing seductively with their arms crossed over their heads. And the painting's colors would also need to change. The card players would probably be clothed, so there would be fewer peach tones in the painting, etc. But it's really interesting that although a painting that is just like Demoiselle, except in what it depicts, would not be like Demoiselle at all, we don't experience any imaginative resistance when we're asked to picture the hypothetical painting. Even though we're asked to picture something quite bizarre, we can do it without much effort. There's a lot more to say here about how that's possible, but I'm just going to take it for granted that we're really good at imagining hypothetical variations of actual artworks. Now that these two concepts have been defined, my account should be much clearer. Once again, I think that counterfactual claims about artworks involve a special kind of comparative judgment between actual works and hypothetical ones. So just to illustrate this account, here's what I think happens when Steinberg offers his evaluation of Demoiselle. First, he introduces a hypothetical variation of Demoiselle that is just like the actual painting, except in some clearly delineated respect, namely that it depicts card players instead. And second, he does a side-by-side comparison of these two paintings and makes a comparative aesthetic judgment that the actual painting more successfully achieves the intended aesthetic effect than the hypothetical painting. So I'm just going to conclude by addressing a puzzle that the account I've offered raises with respect to a widely held view in aesthetics, the acquaintance principle. The acquaintance principle says that aesthetic judgments must be based on perceptual encounters with their objects. If the acquaintance principle is true, then my argument seems to be in trouble. The account of counterfactual reasoning and art criticism that I've offered depends on the possibility of making aesthetic judgments about artworks that we haven't perceived. When we introduce a hypothetical variation of an artwork that hypothetical artwork doesn't magically appear in front of us for us to engage with. The hypothetical work exists only in a very inchoate way in our minds. So here's my proposed solution to this tension. Because hypothetical artworks are just like their actual counterparts, except in clearly specified ways, we have some idea of what the perceptual qualities of hypothetical artworks are like. And I think that's enough to use hypothetical artworks as a point of comparison in a comparative aesthetic judgment. Because comparative aesthetic judgments don't entail any judgments about individual artworks. So it seems perfectly fine to say that a painting that is just like Demoiselle, except that it depicts card players, is a worse painting than Demoiselle, even if it would seem quite bizarre to say that the hypothetical painting is alone, say, a bad painting, because we don't actually know what it looks like. It seems like hypothetical artworks may be objects of comparative aesthetic judgments, even though they can't be the objects of individual aesthetic judgments. A comparative aesthetic judgment that takes a hypothetical artwork as one of its objects is definitely imperfect, but that doesn't mean that comparative aesthetic judgments involving hypothetical artworks can't be a useful tool for us to clarify our judgments about actual works of art. Just as it can be very useful to look at a photograph of a painting despite the limitations of photographs, and just as it can be very helpful to read a score of a musical piece despite the limitations of scores, it can be very useful to compare actual and hypothetical artworks despite the limitations of our knowledge about hypothetical artworks. So the account I've offered is compatible with a weak version of the acquaintance principle, on which it's possible in some cases to make imperfect aesthetic judgments without perceptual counters of their objects. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Time down to 1 second. Well done. Questions, Aaron?
Okay. So
Sorry, I think I froze for a bit.
No, I think Aaron is.
Nathan Wildman asks, I'm going to start with some questions just about the view. Did I freeze?
Yeah, you froze. So Nathan Wildman.
Am I okay now?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Does it always have to be other hypothetical works? When we're thinking about a particular playing a video game, we tend to contrast it with alternative routes or actions we might have taken. This doesn't seem to require a different work, but just a different engagement with the same work.
Totally, that's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about how this view might apply to something like video games, but yeah, I agree there that in that case, it seems like a different engagement with the same work would be the point of comparison in a counterfactual judgment. I think that a lot of the qualities of that case are similar to the ones that I discussed, namely that, you know, you have this like inchoate idea of what that looks like. Maybe it's like a bit clearer in that case since you're engaging with the same work rather than this like hypothetical variation of it. Yeah, so again, like the idea is really inchoate, so it would still be an imperfect aesthetic judgment. But yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Okay, Hannah Kim wanted to ask about the relationship between your view and thought experiments. She asks, do you think thought experiments and hypothetical works work in the same way, showing some other possibility that applies to the actual world?
I need to think about that a bit more. I mean, I guess a lot of times in thought experiments, it's not clear to me that we're comparing like the thought experiment to the real world. So I guess like the account I've offered points out like a real limitation, highlights a real limitation to thought experiments insofar as like, you know, you're taking this hypothetical case. So I argued that, you know, it would be weird to make an aesthetic judgment about an individual hypothetical artwork. So maybe it's like weird in the same way to make a moral judgment, say, about this like hypothetical case. I mean, it feels less weird. But yeah, I think like that might, I think that's why like the two cases aren't exactly analogous. It seems like we're much more comfortable making, say, like moral judgments about hypothetical cases on their own. Whereas in the aesthetic case, it makes much more sense to do it in a comparative way.
Okay, a couple more questions about the hypothetical stuff, and then we turn to the acquaintance principle. So I ask, why does the hypothetical have to be carefully delineated? The work could have been a lot better, seems like a reasonable thing to say in criticism, but there isn't a carefully delineated hypothetical comparison there.
Good, yeah. So I guess, if you were to say like of an actual artwork, it would have been, it would have been a lot better. That seems to me like an incomplete statement.
It could have been a lot better.
Oh, it just like period. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess like to me, like, again, like that seems like kind of like an uninformative, like incomplete thing to say about an artwork. Like it could have been a lot better. Like the next natural question to ask is like, what would have made it better? And then there you would specify exactly what about it you would change. But it could definitely be like a true statement insofar as like there are hypothetical variations of the work that are aesthetically superior to like the actual one. So yeah, I think like claims like that like do have like truth value. They just need to be fleshed out a bit more to be informative in the way I'm interested in.
Okay, transitioning to something that a lot of people have on their minds. Do we really make an aesthetic judgment of the hypothetical work, or do we just imagine it to make a judgment of the actual work?
That's a good question. So I think that judging from like I guess just from like some natural language analysis, like when I think of like counterfactual reasoning and art criticism, it seems to me like we're making comparative judgments, right? So we're saying like this painting would be better if it were changed in whatever such and such way. That said, like that comparative judgment can be useful for us in figuring out what exactly we think is good or bad about the actual painting, and that can lead to a judgment about the actual artwork, and that can lead to a judgment about the artwork on its own. But it seems to me that like whenever the hypothetical work is in play, it's a comparative judgment that's taking place, even if that can help us hone our individual judgment about the artwork.
Okay, so some defenses of the acquaintance principle. Robbie Kubala first asks, can the defender of the acquaintance principle push back by insisting we still need acquaintance with the actual work in order to imagine not hypothetical works per se, but hypothetical features of actual works?
Totally, yeah. I definitely buy that. So for instance, it would be like, I don't think you can form an aesthetic judgment of an artwork on the basis of like testimony or description, though you might be able to form some kind of like imperfect secondhand aesthetic judgment of it on the basis of say like a photograph or reading its score. So I think like at the very least you need that kind of, so I don't agree with like a very strong version of the acquaintance principle on which you always need like firsthand perceptual encounter with the artwork in order to make an aesthetic judgment of it. But certainly we need at least like a secondhand perceptual encounter with it in order to make a judgment of it and to like imagine hypothetical variations of it. So certainly.
Okay, I want to, in the same direction, Alex says, some versions of the acquaintance principle allow that imagination can provide acquaintance. That's supposed to be along lines of the various exceptions for photos, for example. In these cases, you have a lot of perceptual tethering, but you make a small perceptual variation. Do you think a version of the acquaintance principle like this is wrong, or do you think your view still has something to say about that?
Good. So I'm not familiar with this, so I might be thinking about like a different phenomenon than you're thinking about, Alex. But if that's true, if we can have, if like imaginings can be the basis of aesthetic judgments, that seems to be good for my view insofar as it makes the idea of an aesthetic judgment of a of a hypothetical artwork seem more plausible. So because we're like imagining what that artwork looks like, we have like some basis on which to make an aesthetic judgment of it. So that, however, seems to be like a stronger claim than I want to defend, because again, just from like some scenarios I've run through my head, it feels kind of weird to use to make an individual aesthetic judgment of a hypothetical artwork. As for like imagining what like the actual artwork looks like instead of having like a firsthand perceptual encounter of it, and then on the basis of that imagining, sort of positing a hypothetical variation, I think that's really interesting. And I think that's actually what artists might be doing when they're like creating their works. So, you know, if you're an artist and you're thinking like, what would, you know, make for the best artwork or something, you might think like, you know, I could go this way or I could go that way. And then in each case, you're imagining like different hypothetical variations of what the artwork would look like, on the basis of your imaginings, you pick like the best route. So I think like, yeah, thinking about imaginings might help clarify this other implication of my view.
Okay, a few people are interested in the connection between your view, and some stuff that Dan Cavenden-Taylor has said. So here's T explaining it. There's a parallel moment in Dan Cavenden-Taylor's paper where he says that we perform inductive or inferential inferences to aesthetic properties all the time. Artists do this when they're figuring out which mark would work better and deciding before they've seen it. Your view seems to extend this to criticism and readers of criticism. Does that sound right to you? Do you see the connection?
Okay, I might be having like a huge brain fart moment right now because I didn't quite understand like the view. I'm not familiar with it. I'm not sure if you could repeat it or if we're short on time.
T, do you want to just do it?
Yeah. So it's just that Dan Cavenden-Taylor thinks, look, there's a standard view that we don't perform induction or inference to figure out whether an aesthetic property would be good or something like that. But he points out artists do it all the time when they're trying to decide which mark to make. They're making an inductive, like they obviously don't have direct acquaintance because they haven't made it yet. And so my question was, it seems like your view extends that move to both critics and readers of critics.
Yeah, totally. I like completely agree with that. Yeah, thank you for clarifying. Yeah, and I think that like certainly artists do it, and I think, I mean, just from like my experience, like studying art or like looking at art, I think that this is definitely something that we do as well. So that's a great way of putting it. Yeah.
And we're actually out of time. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Angela.
Zoom clap. That's awesome. All right. Next up is Jonathan Gingerich. Jonathan Gingerich with King's College London with Freedom, Perception, and Possibility in Mrs. Dalloway. Take it away, Jonathan.
Oh, thank you and good afternoon. Today I'm going to talk about an excerpt from Virginia Woolf's 1925 novel, Mrs. Dalloway, one of the most canonical modernist novels, and Edmund Husserl's 1929 lectures, Cartesian Meditations, which forms one of the influential texts in the development of existential phenomenology. In doing so, I hope to bring out some underappreciated connections between how Woolf depicts and phenomenologists describe the experience of subjectivity. I have a handout with a passage that I'm going to talk about, which I will share with you right now in the chat, if I can. There we go. So, Mrs. Dalloway is set on a single Wednesday in June 1923 in central London. The novel begins with Clarissa Dalloway walking from her house in Westminster to a florist on Bond Street to pick up flowers for the big party that she's hosting that evening. As she walks through St. James Park, she thinks of her old friend Peter Walsh and of how she decided years ago to marry her husband Richard rather than Peter. And when she reaches the gates of Green Park, she stands looking out at Piccadilly, and we reach the following passage on the handout. She would not say of anyone in the world now that they were this or were that. She felt very young, at the same time unspeakably aged. She sliced like a knife through everything, at the same time was outside looking on. She had a perpetual sense, as she watched the taxicabs, of being out, far out to sea and alone. She always had the feeling that it was very, very dangerous to live even one day. Not that she thought herself clever or much out of the ordinary. How she had got through life on the few twigs of knowledge Fräulein Daniels gave them, she could not think. She knew nothing, no language, no history. She scarcely read a book now, except memoirs in bed. And yet to her, it was absolutely absorbing. All this, the cabs passing, and she would not say of Peter, she would not say of herself, I am this, I am that. Her only gift was knowing people almost by instinct, she thought, walking on. If you put her in a room with someone, up went her back like a cat, or she purred. Devonshire House, Bath House, the house with the china cockatoo. She had seen them all lit up once and remembered Sylvia, Fred, Sally Seton, such hosts of people and dancing all night, and the wagons plodding past to market and driving home across the park. She remembered once throwing a shilling into the Serpentine. But everyone remembered. What she loved was this here now in front of her, the fat lady in the cab. Did it matter then, she asked herself, walking towards Bond Street, did it matter that she must inevitably cease completely? All this must go on without her. Did she resent it, or did it not become consoling to believe that death ended absolutely, but that somehow in the streets of London, on the ebb and flow of things, here, there, she survived, Peter survived, lived in each other, she being part, she was positive, of the trees at home, of the house there, ugly, rambling all to bits and pieces as it was, part of people she had never met, being laid out like a mist between the people she knew best, who lifted her on their branches as she had seen the trees lift the mist, but it spread ever so far, her light, herself. So this is a complex passage, and I will not today comment on even a fraction of its interesting features, but I hope to offer an interpretation that ties together Clarissa's proclamations that she would not say of anyone in the world now that they were this or that, which we might call the refusal, that what she loved was this here now in front of her, which we might call the love, and that it was very, very dangerous to live even one day, which we might call the danger. To get a better sense of what happens in this passage, I suggest turning to Husserl's idea of a horizon, as described in his 1929 Sorbonne Lectures, Cartesian Meditations. Husserl writes, this is also in the handout, every subjective process has a process horizon, which changes with the alteration of the nexus of consciousness to which the process belongs, and with the alteration of the process itself from phase to phase of its flow, an intentional horizon of reference to potentialities of consciousness that belong to the process itself. For Husserl, we are usually only vaguely or marginally aware of things that we aren't focusing our attention on. The vague awareness that we have of things at the horizons of our attention shapes how we think about those things, if and when we focus our attention on them. So if I'm walking through Bloomsbury looking for a shop on Bury Place, I might have a vague awareness of where all the street signs that I pass are and what they say. As I get close to Bury Place, I start looking at the street signs. And when I do this, I don't just search my entire field of vision. I already have a vague sense of where in my field of vision these signs will appear. And when I see the sign for Bury Place, I focus my attention on it, fixing its vague attributes in a much more specific way. When I do this, new horizons open up, possible directions that my attention might take following from my perception alighting on the street sign. I might attend to the building that the sign is affixed to, or to the font in which the street's name is written. And for Husserl, this isn't just about perception. Every subjective process has a process horizon, which Husserl writes, changes with the alteration of the nexus of consciousness to which the process belongs. Every time that I have a subjective experience, there is a horizon, and there's always some possibility of focusing my attention on one thing rather than another, or doing one thing rather than another. I think this will help us to understand Clarissa's experience in the passage that I have read. As she walks through London, the ebb and flow of things is on the horizon of reference for her perception. She might turn her attention to the fat lady in the cab, to dancing all night, to the wagons plodding through the market, or the gate of the park. And each perception that she has, to quote Husserl, horizons made up of other possibilities of perception, as perceptions that she could have if she actively directed the course of perception otherwise. If, for example, she turned her eyes that way instead of this, or if she were to step forward or to one side. When she looks at the lady in the cab, this perception gives rise to new horizons. She might attend to the lady's ear or to her blouse or step toward the lady. But these horizons also cut off the vague possibilities that were associated with the opposite of the cab before she looked more closely. Clarissa slices like a knife through everything because she fixes her attention on one object, now another, and as she does so, cuts off the vague possibilities associated with an object or person, and gives it for a moment a precise specific location and meaning. She feels far out to sea and alone because she alone is present at this focal point of attention. She turns her attention one way, now another, like a knife that shears horizons down to a particular momentary focus of attention. Similarly, when Clarissa does one thing rather than another, like marrying Richard instead of Peter, she collapses a vague and indeterminate horizon of possibilities down to something definite. But at the same time, doing so opens up new horizons of possibility. This leaves us, I hope, with a better understanding of the refusal, the love, and the danger. Clarissa cannot be this or be that, for to be this or to be that would be to be some definite thing, the sort of thing that gets fixed when it becomes the object of attention. But Clarissa sees herself not as any particular such thing, including her body, but as a locus of perceptual and intentional experience that slices through time, settling its attention now on one thing, now on another. She is the consciousness of the horizons that she encounters and is the manifold of possibilities that they open to her. And while Clarissa might feel alone, she's no solipsist. Clarissa does not insist just on not saying of herself, I am this, I am that. She insists on not saying this of Peter either. She recognizes that she is a flight of consciousness that moves across horizons of possibilities, and so too is Peter. And it's not just Peter, although Clarissa's recognition of his and her unfixedness is most intense. It's anyone. Turning to the love, while much of what I have said about horizons applies to everyone who perceives or acts, there are some ways in which Clarissa is different from other people. Everyone remembers, but Clarissa's gift is the quickness and precision of her fixations of attention. She knows people almost by instinct. She's adept at moving the focus of attention across the horizons opened up by other people who she encounters, fixing on definite features of them that open up a particularly rich array of horizons. You put her in a room with another person, up goes her back like a cat, or she purrs. And this process, which may be more or less automatic for Clarissa, is what she loves. Finally, for Clarissa, it's dangerous to live even one day, because doing so involves becoming a particular thing. To be this, to be that, is to be pinned down to what one already is. It's like being turned into a horizon that limits possibilities rather than being the knife that slices through everything. Of course, Clarissa is herself pinned down and again, insofar as she forms part of the horizon of other people's subjective processes. And this is part of the danger. So, Mrs. Dalloway provides a compelling depiction of what it would look like to embrace the existentialist tenet that what we are is essentially a verb, a process. If this is your picture of life, if this is it is the process and its freedom that you will insist on loving. In Clarissa Dalloway, we have an almost uncanny anticipation of what Sartre and Beauvoir will say a few decades later, when Clarissa says that she would not say of herself or of anyone that they are this or are that. There is a kind of betrayal of what one loves, a kind of bad faith in taking oneself to be this or that, when what one loves is the process that happens in time of fixing upon one horizon and then another. So I look forward to your questions about this passage.
Thank you, Jonathan. Question chair, please take it away.
From Jonathan Neufeld. Is there a difference between identifying someone as this or that and perceiving them or some aspect of them sharply for a moment? Is there a continuum of pinning down?
That's interesting. So I think that on my reading, I think that the pinning down, sort of someone, it is in some way perceiving them as this or that, but there's also a continuum in that every horizon opens up new horizons of possible perception and action. So when Clarissa's perception alights on the lady in the cab, some of what's happening is that she's turning that lady into an object of her attention. There are attributes that sort of constrain the possibilities for how her perception might move along the person who she encounters. But there are sort of new possibilities are going to move into the horizons of her perception or her other subjective processes. So maybe there's a possibility that she recognizes the lady and they have a conversation or something like that. I think the thing that's consistent with the thing that's consistent with being a transcendental ego is that there are always that sort of every time that you slice through time and space to focus on a particular thing, you open up these new possibilities that are associated with the thing that you perceive. But there's it's that very same process that cuts someone down to being this or to being that.
From T, is there a difference between pinning down what someone is and pinning down what you love about them? That is the reasons of love.
I think that they're similar. Now, and part of this is because of the sort of relationship between Clarissa Dalloway and Peter. I think that part of what Clarissa loves about Peter Walsh particularly is that she finds it impossible to pin down what she loves about him. She sort of always comes back to think in moments like when she's walking through St. James Park, she thinks back to sort of her relationship with Peter years ago and wonders what he would say about something that she encounters. And part of what the love that she has of Peter is about is that she isn't entirely sure what Peter's take on anything would be. She has some sense of it. So there are horizons that sort of restrict what the possibilities are, but there are also a lot of possibilities within those horizons.
Hannah Kim asks, is it others' inability to do what Clarissa does, paying attention and getting rid of vague potentialities, that make her laid out like a mist between the people she knew best? Or do you have another reading of that metaphor?
Good. So I do have another reading of that metaphor. I think that the sense in which Clarissa is laid out like a mist is the sense in which she also always forms a part of the horizon of other individuals' perceptions of her and actions toward her. So while she sees herself as this knife slicing through space and time, she recognizes that she's also the object of other people's perception. And I think that when she says, for instance, when she talks about the consolation of death, and when she talks about surviving in Peter and being part of the trees at home, she sees the horizons that are part of her perception and herself as the horizon of other people's perception as part of what she is. And so the mist that she is, in some sense, is sort of the residue that she leaves insofar as she restricts the possibilities of other people, while at the same time opening up new possibilities for perception and action when they encounter her.
Cynthia Freeland asks, how does this somewhat aesthetic view of others and oneself fit in with a moral outlook? I'm thinking of this as the difference between the Husserlian horizons view and the moral stance you find in Camus or Sartre. And of course, Woolf too provides moral assessments in her own way.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking as I was preparing this, there's a lot of parallel between this passage in which that we get from Clarissa and some of what Beauvoir says in Ethics of Ambiguity, where sort of the ethical requirement of existential phenomenology is taken to be acknowledging the ambiguity of sort of both oneself and others as both subject and object. And I think that this comes out in Clarissa's insistence that it's not just her who isn't this or that, but it's anyone who isn't this or that. And so I think that's sort of the ethical perspective that we get from Clarissa. There's this very intersubjective awareness of this transcendental possibility that Clarissa has. And I think it's in some ways, we also get a depiction of different takes on this in the novel. So Clarissa is much more willing to sort of open up to the broad horizon of possibilities that any character who she encounters, even sort of boring characters, provides, compared to Peter Walsh, who's often very judgmental of Peter, of people that he encounters. Like there's this character, Hugh Whitbread, who's an old friend of both Clarissa and Peter, who's this very dull sort of conventional character. And Peter has these extremely scathing assessments of him, but Clarissa sort of insists on seeing some horizon of possibility that's opened up by her past relationship with Hugh. And so there may be these sort of different takes on what sorts of ethical requirements there are of this understanding of being a phenomenological point of view.
Heather Whitney asks, often Septimus is seen as Mrs. Dalloway's foil. Do you think his shell shock and his resulting inability to freely traverse the horizons, his always being stuck and pulled back in. Does that help your view?
Yeah, I think that it does. I mean, so one thing that I didn't talk a whole lot about in this presentation, but I think that's also important, is the way that death is an ultimate constraint on the horizons of possibility for any transcendental ego. And I think that Septimus sort of makes that apparent, and that's something that Clarissa appreciates, particularly later in the novel after she learns of Septimus's death. But I also think that sort of Septimus shows ways in which the sort of freedom that I'm talking about can be restricted. So there's a passage nearby where in the Husserl book, where Husserl talks about how this sort of freedom, this freedom of being able to move your attention one way or another, or sort of step forward or to the side, is a sort of freedom that, like any other, can be constrained to a greater or lesser degree. And I think that maybe Septimus shows some ways in which the freedom to sort of move one's horizon in ways that open up indefinitely many possibilities can be constrained in ways that it isn't for Clarissa.
Alex Fisher writes, much of Mrs. Dalloway consists of the characters reminiscing about their past horizons of possibility, returning to them and testing their boundaries in this particular moment in time. To what extent does each decision legacy determine a character's fixed identity or represent a multiplicity of identity within the character?
I think that does a lot. So another thing that I didn't talk about much in this presentation, but that's really important, I think, is the way that memory operates for Husserl and for Clarissa Dalloway. And I think particularly, so Husserl says that to each perception, there always belongs a horizon of the past, to the potentiality of awakenable recollection. And to every recollection, there belongs as a horizon the continuing intervening intentionality of possible recollections up to the actual now. And I think that for Clarissa, like when she recalls throwing a shilling into the Serpentine, she recalls, first of all, this rather than all the other possible memories that she might recall. So she focuses her attention on this one particular thing. And when she focuses on that, it opens up as a horizon sort of all the paths between that past memory and the now that she's currently inhabiting. There are lots of different sort of stories that she might tell, connecting that past moment that her memory alights on and the now that she encounters.
From way out in left field, Jonathan Neufeld says, it seems like writing someone as a character is the ultimate way to say that someone is this or that. But this characterization also seems wildly at odds with Woolf's writing in characters. So maybe I'm just getting this completely wrong. Can you say something about the relationship between the form of the novel and pinning down characters? Yeah, so I mean, I think that part of what my reading of part of what Woolf is doing is that she's trying to write characters in a way that resists them being pinned down to being this or being that. She wants to present Woolf. She wants to present Clarissa and Peter particularly, and Septimus, I think, as these characters that deny sort of like being a character in the stereotypical sense of being a character. And I think that this also comes through in the form that her novels take. She's trying to present sort of I think that the use of stream of consciousness in the novel is one thing that attempts to sort of deny that there is a particular thing that Clarissa is or that anyone is. And I think that this is also what some critics of Woolf's novels disagree with, that they want characters to be something that have more definite shape than Woolf wants them to take on.
Okay, that is all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Zoom clap. Thanks for coming, everyone, to the summer workshop series. It's been a great time. If you have any comments about how this was conducted or ideas to make it better in the future, we'll probably be doing something like this again in the new Zoom pandemic era of sorrow. So please let me know. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thanks to all our presenters. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and some of us will hang out for a little while if people want to just talk about some stuff today. I can be on for about 15 minutes or so.